Japan's behavior in World War II can only be described as evil. The Japanese committed massacre after massacre, killing tens of millions of civilians. They engaged in sexual slavery, with Asian women forced to work in brothels. Perhaps the most depraved were their human experimentation laboratories, where all manner of horrific things were done. Experiments included injecting victims with diseases or animal blood. Some people had their limbs amputated to see how fast they would die of blood loss. All that begs the question, how did Japan become so evil? A huge amount of attention goes to the story of Germany and its descent into madness. The rise of Hitler and the Nazis is one of the most studied things in all of history. So, does Japan have a similar story? Was there a Japanese equivalent of Hitler who seemingly came out of nowhere and completely transformed the character of the nation? Or was Japan simply always like that, extremely brutal and violent? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of the history, the story of the Japanese Empire. In the mid-1800s, Japan was quite a backwards place. It was totally isolated from the rest of the world and governed by a political system that was essentially feudalism. There was an emperor, but most political power was held by regional warlords. Those warlords were constantly fighting with each other, which meant that Japan was always divided and obsessed with its own internal affairs. As a result, Japan had minimal contact with the rest of the world. However, Japan was very soon going to be forced out of its isolation, whether it liked it or not. In 1853, an American naval expedition arrived at Tokyo and threatened war if Japan didn't open up for trade. The Japanese recognized the military superiority of the Americans and were forced to agree to a trade deal. For the Japanese population, that was extremely humiliating. They were a proud people, so it was intolerable to be dictated to in such a way. The whole episode actually resulted in a deep political crisis in Japan that would end up transforming the country. It was a constitutional revolution that came to be known as the Meiji Restoration. The power of the regional warlords declined, and Japan became more united around one central figure, the emperor. A constitution was drawn up which established a parliamentary system modelled on Britain. There were also radical economic reforms. Capitalism was adopted, and there was rapid industrialization. In just a few decades, Japan went from being a backwards feudal state to an economic powerhouse with modern industries like textiles, shipbuilding, and steel production. It also modernized its military, adopting Western tactics and weaponry. By the end of the 1800s, Japan was unrecognizable. It was now a modern nation and a major power on the international stage. However, with its astonishing progress came a newfound confidence and even arrogance. Japan now believed that it was superior to every other nation in Asia. To prove its superiority, it wanted to humble the greatest power of the region, China. China had long been the hegemon of East Asia, dominating through its enormous size and population. In particular, China controlled Korea, which was incredibly strategically important. For Japan, Korea was a bridge onto the Asian mainland. For it to be a vassal of China was intolerable. In 1894, war broke out, and to the surprise of everyone, Japan won. The modernized Japanese military totally outclassed the Chinese, and in less than a year, the war was over. In the resulting treaty, Korea became independent of China, and Japan also got control of Taiwan. Over the next few years, Japan would continue expanding into Asia, which would bring it into conflict with another major power of the time, Russia. Russia was also expanding into Asia and was looking to take control of Korea and Manchuria. Needless to say, Japan was not going to accept that. However, the Japanese actually wanted to avoid war with Russia. They wanted to make an agreement where Russia would take Manchuria and Japan would take Korea. In fact, in 1901, one of the most important Japanese statesmen visited the Russian capital with the hope of making a deal. The Russians treated him extremely badly and pretty much ignored him. Eventually, after months of humiliation, he left. Over the next few years, Japanese diplomats continued to try to get a meeting with the Russian Tsar and make a deal, but they were all treated with contempt. Eventually, after years of trying to find a diplomatic solution, the Japanese gave up and chose war. In February of 1904, they launched a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur. Again, everyone expected Japan to lose the war. After all, Russia was one of the most powerful nations on earth. However, for a second time, Japan exceeded all expectations and outclassed the Russians on land and sea. After less than 2 years of fighting, the Russians were forced to abandon the war and sign a humiliating peace deal. Japan's victory was total. Having defeated both China and Russia, it was now the dominant power in East Asia and had a free hand to do whatever it wanted. Eventually, in 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea. As you would imagine, the transformation of Japan drew the attention of the other world powers. Britain decided to make an alliance, and that would end up being important during the First World War. Japan's involvement in World War I is often forgotten, but it actually played an important role in seizing German colonies in Asia. As a result, when the war finished, Japan was awarded some new territories. However, the territory that the Japanese got was small, and that caused resentment. Over the next few years, Japanese resentment towards the West continued to grow. In fact, in 1921, a pro-Western prime minister was actually assassinated. That was the beginning of a long period of political instability in Japan. Over the next 2 decades, 20 governments came and went, most of them lasting less than a year. Gradually, politics became dominated more and more by extremists and militarists who wanted more expansion in Asia. In 1931, they got their wish as Japan invaded Manchuria, a resource-rich territory northeast of China. Japan had had troops there since 1905. However, since then, a group of generals had taken full control of the army and were essentially acting independently. Those generals, totally without authorization from Tokyo, actually decided to annex the entire region. The government in Tokyo did try to stop them, but that led to the assassination of yet another prime minister in 1932. By that point, it was clear that it was the military, not the politicians, that held the real power in Japan. From that point on, Japanese politics became more and more extreme. Faced with international condemnation, it embraced isolation and left the League of Nations. In 1936, it allied with Nazi Germany, and the next year it launched a full-blown invasion of China. Japan quickly took a huge amount of Chinese territory, particularly the coast and the major cities. The invasion of China was the point of no return for Japan. It cemented its descent into evil. I'm going to go into more detail later about the full extent of the Japanese atrocities, but for now I'll just say that they were truly evil, absolutely comparable to the Nazis. The big turning point of the war came after 4 years, in 1941. Essentially, the Japanese made an attempt to dominate all of Asia and the Pacific. First, they launched a surprise attack on the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, making an enemy of the United States. Then they invaded much of the rest of Asia, including Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. Those territories were unable to resist, and very quickly Japan ruled an enormous empire and about 400 million people. However, over the next few years, the Japanese would gradually lose the war against America. The Americans employed a policy of island hopping, gradually getting closer and closer to Japan by capturing strategic islands. By 1945, the United States had all but won the war, but it wasn't clear how to get Japan to surrender. Faced with the prospect of a costly invasion of the Japanese mainland, the United States opted to use a devastating new weapon. In August of 1945, they dropped nuclear bombs on 2 Japanese cities, forcing Japan to surrender. With that, Japan had to give up its empire and withdraw from its colonies. In total, its excursion into Asia had cost the lives of about 30 million people. So, that is what happened, the rise and fall of the Japanese empire. Now, this video is about why Japan behaved so horrifically in the war, so I think it's worth going through some of the things that they actually did. There are numerous examples of the cruelty of the Japanese, many of them not very well known. One example was their horrific human experimentation laboratories. The most famous was Unit 731, where roughly 300,000 people died. Experiments included the injection of diseases or animal blood, deliberate dehydration or surgery without anesthesia. Limbs were amputated to see how fast the victim would die of blood loss. Some prisoners had their stomachs surgically removed and their esophagus reattached to their intestines. The victims included children and even babies. Flamethrowers were tested on live people, with the victims tied to stakes and burned alive. In other experiments, victims were placed into low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their sockets. Another example of the Japanese evil was the 3 alls policy. The 3 alls referred to kill all, burn all, and loot all. Essentially, because they were finding it impossible to distinguish between civilians and soldiers, the solution of the Japanese was to kill any Chinese that they found. Even if they were clearly civilians, they had to die. Japan also committed some horrific massacres, one of the most famous being the Nanking Massacre, one of the worst war crimes of the century. Over 6 weeks, roughly 200,000 civilians were murdered, often in the most sadistic of ways. Babies were thrown into the air and caught on the bayonets of Japanese rifles. In one infamous story, 2 Japanese soldiers had a contest to see who could be the first to kill 100 people. There was also the mass rape of Chinese women. The Japanese didn't just commit atrocities in China. For instance, in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, up to 500,000 people were massacred. The Japanese used Filipino women and children as human shields to protect themselves. Those that survived were then murdered. As you can see, the Japanese were truly evil, and even more frightening was the sheer number of people that lived under them. From 1942 to 1945, about 400 million people were subjects of the Japanese Empire. With so many people living under such a brutal regime, the number of deaths was truly staggering. It's impossible to know exactly how many people they killed, but it might have been as many as 30 million. So, the question then is why? Why was Japan so astonishingly evil? How did it end up so crazy? Well, one of the first questions I'd like to address is whether Japan's terrible behavior had its roots far back in Japanese history, or if it was more of a short-term thing. To put it another way, if World War II had happened 2 or 3 decades earlier, would Japan have behaved so horrifically? I think, as is so often the case, it's a bit of a mix of both long-term and short-term causes. First, let's talk about the long-term causes. I think that Japan's actions were definitely, in part, due to long-standing beliefs and values that had been part of Japanese culture for centuries. A good example is the glorification of warriors, in particular the samurai. The samurai were both an elite warrior class and the ruling nobles of Japan. At the heart of the samurai tradition was a strict moral code known as Bushido. Bushido emphasized virtues like loyalty, courage, honor, and a willingness to die for one's cause. While those values can be noble, in Japan they fostered a culture where violence was glorified. By the 1900s, the samurai no longer existed, but there were still the remnants of the traditional warrior-like value system. Those ideas were very much in conflict with some of the new liberal ideas that Japan was adopting from the West. For example, the Bushido idea of self-sacrifice for the emperor clashed with the Western ideal of a free citizen in a democratic society. Of course, new liberal ideas were welcome as long as Japan was prospering. However, during the hard interwar period, Japanese society returned to its past traditions, loaded with false notions of greatness and the glorification of violence. Another important traditional Japanese idea was that the emperor was more than just a human, he was a divine figure. That notion was deeply rooted in Japan's traditional religion, Shinto. The emperor was believed to be a direct descendant of the sun goddess, Amaterasu. That divine lineage gave the emperor enormous symbolic power. His divine status became a cornerstone of the national ideology, and in the early 1900s it was used by Japan's leaders to justify military aggression. The annexation of Korea and Manchuria and the invasion of China were all framed as fulfilling a sacred mission. They were, in a sense, holy war, almost a crusade, and crucially, all means were allowed. In some ways, Japan's attitudes towards war and brutality were what they were because that was actually just typical of Asia in general. For example, the Chinese also believed that whoever had the power to rule also had the right to rule. In China, there was the notion of the mandate of heaven, which held that any man could claim to be the legitimate ruler if he could defeat the current ruler. Essentially, Asia as a whole had a value system similar to what Europe had had thousands of years earlier, where might is right and strength is valorized. Europe, influenced by Christianity, had since moved away from those sorts of attitudes. There were notions such as that the powerful had a duty to the weak, or that rulers needed the consent of the governed. In Asia, there was far less of that sort of sentiment. So, those are some of the long-term, deep-rooted reasons for Japan's brutality in World War II. However, we can actually be sure that they weren't the whole story. That is because Japan hadn't always behaved so badly during times of war. In fact, only 3 decades earlier, during the Russo-Japanese War, Japan didn't behave with anything like the same brutality. One Western journalist actually wrote about how well the Russian prisoners of war were treated by the Japanese. He wrote, "The chivalry displayed by the Japanese towards a fallen foe has been demonstrated on innumerable occasions since the momentous crossing of the Yalu. I have witnessed the considerate treatment of the Russian prisoners, treatment which could not be excelled in point of consideration by any army in the world. Similarly, during the First World War, German prisoners of war were treated very well. They apparently played football matches, not only amongst themselves, but also against local club teams. They were even allowed to go on weekly excursions and put on theatrical productions. The contrast between that civilized Japanese army with the one from World War II is astonishing. So, the question is, what changed in the meantime to cause such an enormous difference in behavior? I think a very quick summary could go something like this. First, there was a huge amount of anti-Western resentment caused by Japan getting repeatedly humiliated. That resentment destabilized politics, which in turn allowed the military to get far too much power. First, let's talk about the resentment. In the decades before World War II, Japan suffered numerous humiliations, which led to resentment, and eventually a dark strain of nationalism. The first humiliation was the way that Japan was forced at gunpoint to open up to international trade. As I mentioned earlier, in 1853, an American fleet threatened to destroy Tokyo if the Japanese didn't accept a trade agreement. That was followed by a series of exploitative treaties that granted Western powers, trade privileges, control over ports, and even the ability to ignore Japanese laws. Those treaties were forcibly imposed on Japan, which caused anger in the population. The Japanese people saw them as humiliating, a symbol of their subjugation by the Western powers. That resentment made Japan determined to industrialize and modernize as fast as possible to show the world that they weren't inferior. That did actually work fairly well. By 1900, Japan had a more equal relationship with the other global powers, and it was even able to renegotiate some of the humiliating treaties. However, the resentment didn't go away. In fact, it actually got worse after World War I. When that war was over, Japan joined the other great powers at Versailles to discuss the creation of the League of Nations and the post-war order. During those discussions, Japan made a very reasonable request. It proposed a racial equality clause, which would ensure that the West treated all nations equally regardless of race. The European powers rejected the proposal. That was a humiliating blow to Japan. Not only was it a diplomatic defeat, but it also reinforced the Japanese perception that they were viewed as racially inferior. Over the next few years, there were even more humiliations. In 1922, there was something called the Washington Naval Treaty. That was an agreement between the 5 major naval powers of the time to agree on how big their navies could be. However, the treaty was unfair on Japan, which was restricted to a navy of only 60% the size of Britain or America. It was yet another humiliation. Then, 2 years later, the United States passed the Immigration Act. That prevented immigration from Japan and the rest of Asia, and the Japanese took it as a message that they weren't welcome in the West. All those humiliations gradually caused anti-Western resentment, which in turn had a profound effect on Japanese politics. The most obvious example of that was 1921, when the Prime Minister Hara Takahashi was assassinated. Hara was relatively liberal in his politics and was Japan's first Prime Minister not to come from the aristocracy. Most importantly, he was known to be pro-Western and in favor of international cooperation. In fact, he was actually assassinated just as he prepared to go and agree the Washington Naval Treaty that I mentioned earlier. Nationalists and elements of the military were angered by his willingness to compromise and viewed it as a betrayal of Japan's interests. The assassination showed that those who favored aggressive, isolationist policies were willing to use violence to get what they wanted. That assassination was the beginning of a period of instability in Japanese politics. All throughout the 1920s, Japan was going through quite an unstable transition from the old political order to a more modern democratic system. Japan had actually had some of the structures of democracy for some time. The Meiji Constitution of 1889 created an elected House of Representatives, but only the richest 2% of men qualified to vote. Gradually, over the decades, suffrage expanded, and eventually in 1925, all men were given the right to vote. Hearing that, it might sound like Japan was moving in the right direction and liberalizing. However, the whole thing almost happened too fast and provoked something of a backlash. As political power was increasingly devolved to the people, the conservative establishment grew nervous about the threat of new left-wing groups. To counter that, they passed something called the Peace Preservation Law. That was essentially an explicitly anti-left-wing law that criminalized any movement that tried to alter Japan's established political order. Socialist, communist, and left-wing groups had begun to gain traction in the 1920s, but were now explicitly excluded from political life. The law allowed for the arrest of anyone deemed a threat to the existing system. The effects of the law were particularly apparent in Korea, where Japanese colonial authorities used it to suppress any form of resistance or nationalist sentiment. Korean activists advocating for independence were arrested, imprisoned, or even executed. Together, the introduction of universal male suffrage and the Peace Preservation Law created a political environment that skewed increasingly to the right. While more people were now able to vote, the range of political options available to them had been severely restricted. Nationalist and conservative parties that favored a strong authoritarian state began to dominate politics. Liberal movements advocating for social reform were marginalized. Politics also became more extreme because of economic problems. Those started in 1927 when there were a series of bank failures. The banks had taken on far too much debt, which then led to bank runs. The government tried to address the crisis with strict economic measures, but that caused unemployment and poverty to soar. Then the situation got even worse when there was the global financial crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression. Japan was particularly hard hit by the Depression. In only 2 years, economic output fell by a whopping 18%. That was worse than Britain, the United States, France, or even Germany. The effects on the population were catastrophic. Just like what happened in Germany, the mainstream political parties were discredited and politics became more extreme. Now, everything I've talked about thus far, the resentment, the political instability, the marginalization of the left, these are all important things for explaining why Japan went so crazy in World War II. However, I think that in some ways their role is really to set the stage for the biggest reason of all. That is that Japan was basically taken over by the military. In fact, by the mid-1930s, Japan was essentially a military dictatorship, and the generals had ceased to pay any attention to the civilian government in Tokyo. With that power, the military then went rogue. It became uncontrollable and began to do whatever it wanted. The culmination of that would be all the atrocities that it committed in World War II. The first step of that process came out of Japan's involvement in Manchuria in the northeast of China. Ever since the war with Russia, Japan had had influence in Manchuria, including a small military presence. In fact, they had actually helped the ruler of Manchuria, Zhang Zuolin, come to power. Throughout the 1920s, Zhang Zuolin and the Japanese cooperated and had a mutually beneficial relationship. Zhang allowed Japan to operate significant infrastructure, such as railways and coal mines. However, in the late 1920s, relations began to cool. Over time, Zhang became more aligned with the Chinese nationalists and tried to reduce Japanese influence in Manchuria. That created friction with the Japanese military forces there, and they began to view Zhang as a threat to their interests. What the Japanese forces in Manchuria wanted was for Japan to get even more involved in the region, actually to fully occupy it. However, the Japanese government in Tokyo didn't agree with the military on that. They were worried that more involvement would be expensive and cause chaos. That disagreement was the beginning of a years-long power struggle between the government and the military. Frustrated with both Tokyo and their Manchurian warlord partner, the Japanese forces in Manchuria devised a ruthless and cynical plot to get what they wanted. Their plan was to assassinate the Manchurian warlord, removing him as an obstacle. That would then cause chaos in Manchuria, which would force Tokyo to accept that Japan had to get more involved in the region. They were acting of their own volition, totally without authorization. In June of 1928, the assassination went ahead. One of the Japanese soldiers in Manchuria planted a bomb on a bridge, which then exploded as Zhang Zuolin's train passed by. Mortally wounded, Zhang died a few days later. However, the assassination didn't manage to get the government in Tokyo to do what the military wanted. In fact, it actually caused a political crisis. First, the Prime Minister admitted that Japanese troops were responsible and promised to find those involved and prosecute them. However, that caused a backlash in the conservative establishment and the military. They argued that if the incident was investigated, Japan would look extremely bad and might even have to withdraw completely from Manchuria. That would ruin years of hard work to establish Japan in the region. In the end, the conservatives and the military won, and the Prime Minister was forced to back down. As you can see, the military was getting more and more powerful, while the civilian government was becoming less. In fact, a few months later, the Prime Minister was actually forced to resign. That further emboldened the military, and over the next few years, they took more steps to increase their power over the civilian government. In November of 1930, they assassinated a Prime Minister who wasn't doing what they wanted. That Prime Minister had just negotiated a new naval treaty with America and Britain, which was seen as a betrayal by the military. In November of 1930, he was shot and later died from his wounds. Then, just a few months later, there was a full-blown attempted coup. In March of 1931, a group of young army officers belonging to a secret society tried to topple the government and install a military dictatorship. The officers believed that that was the only way to address the economic struggles of the Great Depression and re-establish Japan's diminishing international prestige. The coup did fail, but the plotters received only very mild punishments. Then, in September of 1931, the military performed its most daring plot of the whole period. In Manchuria, they staged an explosion near a Japanese outpost and then blamed the nearby Chinese troops. They then used that as an excuse to launch a full-scale military invasion. It was a classic false flag operation. The military had, totally without authorization from Tokyo, started a war with China. Over the next few days, Japanese forces killed hundreds of Chinese soldiers and very quickly took a lot of territory. Again, the response from the government in Tokyo was very weak. It hesitated and failed to condemn the military's actions. It did call for them to stop, but they simply refused. As you can see, the army in Manchuria was completely rogue, completely out of control. However, what they did next was even more shocking than anything I've told you about so far. The Manchurian army demanded that the government in Tokyo support their occupation of Manchuria and threatened that if it didn't, they would declare independence from Japan. They actually had a declaration of independence ready and they were threatening to publish it. It said the following: "It may be necessary for members of the army in Manchuria committed to our cause to temporarily renounce their Japanese nationality in order to achieve the rapid advancement of our aims." Now, that probably was just a bluff and they weren't really going to do it, but it did throw the Japanese government into complete chaos. All the while, the Manchurian army continued to take more territory. They quickly defeated the local Chinese warlord and then advanced on the Manchurian capital. They demanded authorization from Tokyo to take the capital, but the government ordered them to halt the advance and withdraw. With relations between Tokyo and the military now extremely hostile, the stage was set for another coup attempt. Again, members of the military tried to topple the government and install a military dictatorship. Like previously, the plan did fail, but again the punishments were extremely mild, even milder than they had been after the previous coup attempt. That inability of the government to show any authority further destabilized it and led to its fall in December. With Tokyo in chaos, the Japanese army in Manchuria captured the capital from the Chinese. The next year, 1932, was the last chance for the civilian government to try to claw back some power from the military. A new prime minister was appointed who was an experienced politician. His main goal was to regain control of the military and try to end the war with China. No prizes for guessing what happened to him. He was, indeed, assassinated. That assassination effectively ended civilian governance in Japan. From that point on, the military had unchecked power. There had been essentially a slow military coup over the course of years. The power struggle between the military and the government was over, and the military had won. They were now free to do as they wished. The atrocities committed by Japan during World War II were a direct result of that military takeover. The Manchurian army in particular developed an especially brutal and evil culture. The success of the Manchurian campaign increased their prestige and helped them become some of the top commanders when Japan invaded the rest of China and Asia. It was men from the Manchurian army that oversaw atrocities like the Nanking massacre. They also played a key role in Japan's non-military atrocities. For example, the human experimentation at the notorious Unit 731 was done by a clandestine division of the Manchurian army. Those men also infiltrated key positions in what remained of the civilian government. One of them actually became Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 to 1944, while another served as Minister of War. So, why was Japan so evil in World War II? Well, there are many different things that contributed to it, but for me the most important is the takeover by the military. Japan came to be controlled by the most brutal, psychopathic subsection of its society. The men that came to run the show weren't just ordinary members of the military, but the Manchurian army, a particularly ruthless group. Through numerous assassinations, violence and intimidation, they managed to accrue total power over Japan. They then turned Japan into something totally alien to what it had been just a few decades earlier. What might have happened to Asia if the Japanese Empire had continued to dominate it for decades doesn't bear thinking about. We must all be grateful to those that fought to bring about its end.